In late 1978, the Rhodesian War was coming to a close. Almost 13 years earlier, the brave Rhodesians had thrown off their shackles and said no when asked to commit suicide. Ever since that fateful day, on the 11th of November 1965, when they declared their independence, the Rhodesians have been locked in constant conflict to varying degrees. The terrorist raids into the country had started off in fiasco, disappeared altogether, and then promptly started back up again. Despite crippling sanctions from almost the entire world, the Rhodesians continued to easily win every engagement with an absurd 10-to-1 kill-death ratio. The Rhodesian light infantry sometimes had a 40-to-1 or 50-to-1 kill-death ratio, a figure the Rhodesians were almost too proud of and never shut up about. There were, however, a lot more black terrorists than there were Rhodesian troupies. The terrorists could stomach the 10 losses. The Rhodesians could barely stomach the 1. Each and every man counted. Now, in 1978, the war was getting hotter and hotter. Despite the endless string of military victories, there were other problems. The world was putting more and more pressure on Rhodesia to give in, and it was this that was taking Rhodesia down. The South African government, along with Henry Kissinger, had essentially put a gun to Ian Smith's head and made him accept black majority rule or else. The Rhodesian PM had to accept, and he now, temporarily, ran the country as part of the transitional government alongside his black counterparts, Muzorewa, Sithole, and Chirao. Importantly, however, the security forces were kept in white hands, or, as Smith put it, civilized hands. The Rhodesians were on their way out, but they certainly weren't down just yet. Morale was sagging. Whites were emigrating in record numbers, and the world was falling down around them. But Rhodesia could still fight, and had enough white men with the will to do so. Indeed, it would be the year 1978 in which the Rhodesian security forces would have their finest hour and place their names in the history books forever. A couple things before we begin. Firstly, a quick disclaimer. This video is in no way, shape, or form political and is purely a work of history. Please don't overthink it. Thank you. Secondly, a huge thank you to those of you who have signed up to my subscribe star or as a YouTube member. A few months ago, my main source of income, my Patreon, was randomly banned. Those of you who have swapped over to the other platforms have really saved the channel and allow me to keep making these videos for a living. And I really cannot thank you all enough. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. It means the world. Cheers. The beginning of 1978 was a rough one for Rhodesia. On the 3rd of January, terrorists attacked the Leopard Rock Hotel, a popular tourist destination east of Salisbury. On the 8th, Sheila Cumming and her 15-year-old daughter, Sarah, were murdered, also near Salisbury. On the same day, 20-year-old Luis Carvalho, a Portuguese man working for the Electricity Supply Commission, was randomly ambushed and murdered in cold blood. 2 days later, on the 10th, Rainbow's End Farm was hit 100 kilometers southwest of Salisbury. The victims were Sheila Brackenridge, a bedridden grandmother, her 35-year-old son, Benjamin, as well as her grandson, Bruce, and his friend, Alan Harris, both aged 15. This was not the only incident of the day. On the main road from Salisbury to Kariba, 3 brothers were shot dead in an ambush. They were 16, 13, and 7 years old. A 4th brother, 10-year-old James, managed to survive by playing dead when the terrorists ransacked the vehicle afterwards. All of these incidents were bad enough, and the sheer frequency of them was absolutely unprecedented. But it was the next incident which sent shockwaves through Rhodesian society. On the 12th of January, the Rhodesian Herald ran the front page headline, "Boy Killed in Attack Near Salisbury," and defense reporter Chris Reynolds wrote, quote, "A group of terrorists last night gunned down a 15-year-old boy as he and his parents were returning to their home just 2 kilometers outside the Salisbury boundary, off the road to Domboshawa. The dead boy was Colin Tilley, whose parents owned the property off Glen Forest Road, the first turning left outside the Salisbury limits," end quote. Colin had been shot in the back of the head right in front of his father's eyes. It was horror right in the heart of Rhodesia. Previously, most incidents had been confined to the sharp end, Rhodesia's northeast. Usually, the terrorist efforts would end in comedic failure and would end up getting themselves killed almost as soon as they'd entered the country. Now, however, they were pushing deeper into Rhodesia and beginning to actually succeed in their evil deeds. The terrorist strategy, put simply, was to avoid the Rhodesian security forces and to target women, children, and the elderly. Whenever they came up against a grown man, or even a determined woman, child, or senior citizen, the terrorists tended to come off worse. In fact, Colin's grandmother, Dorothy Tilley, was in a little granny cottage 50 meters from the main house, but the terrorists had been tipped off that she had a rifle. These mighty warriors chose to steer clear of the house. They couldn't bring themselves to confront little old Dorothy with her rifle. In the following year, there was little Jamie Scott, a 15-year-old boy. He was ambushed along with his friend, Scott, on their motorcycle and struck by 5 of the terrorist bullets. Jamie survived the initial shock and single-handedly pursued his savage attackers into the bush with his unreliable G3 rifle, saving both he and his friend's life. He became an overnight hero and was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Award. Jamie's story was merely one of many. All of these heroics, however, could not make up for what was happening. There seemed to be an infinite number of terrorists, and the heroes couldn't win every single time. The savages only had to get lucky once every now and then for their tactics to take effect. There were only just over 200 Rhodesians, and falling. As former Prime Minister Roy Walensky put it, emigration was the, quote, hemorrhage that would bleed us to death, end quote. The bad news continued to roll in as 1978 chugged along. This was the year of the infamous Elim Pentecostal Mission massacre in Upper Vomba that saw 8 British missionaries and 4 children raped, bayoneted, hacked and shot to death. Missionaries and Red Cross workers, those seeking to actually help both sides, seemed to be the terrorists' favourite target. Early 1978 also saw 2 Swiss Red Cross workers murdered in the Eastern Highlands, as well as 2 German missionaries. It wasn't all doom and gloom, of course. The security forces continued to dominate the field, and terrorist losses were higher than ever and rising. In March, the internal settlement was signed between Smith and his 3 black counterparts, and in April, 9 black ministers were sworn in. Many were skeptical, but others tried to see the best of things and thought that maybe, just maybe, the hell was all about to come to an end. Surely Britain would recognise the new government. After all, wasn't that what she'd always wanted and demanded? The only man missing from this arrangement that really mattered was Joshua Nkomo. If a deal was made with this devil, then that might just be the final piece of the puzzle. This, at least, was Ian Smith's logic when he went off to speak to the man himself in Zambia secretly in August. The talks were productive, and as Smith put it, in keeping with my own thoughts. They had been arranged by the British and some of the African states which had involved themselves in the Rhodesian situation. On the 14th, the 2 of them talked until after midnight and worked out a plan to bring Nkomo into the government. Mugabe was to be officially invited too, but everyone knew that he would reject any deal that made him a subordinate of Nkomo, and he would thus isolate himself. This was an unprecedented offer from the Rhodesians. Nkomo would get everything he'd ever wanted on a plate. At 5 p.m. on the 3rd of September, Air Rhodesia Flight 825 took off from the Kariba Airport runway and headed for Salisbury. The plane was packed full of families, especially amongst the residents of Bulawayo on the flight, of which there was a lot. There was no direct flight, and so the most efficient route was to head for the capital and then from there take one of the frequent flights to Bulawayo. Everything was as normal. The Viscount was climbing well, and air hostesses Dulce and Brenda were already well into action and serving their 52 passengers. The last passenger to board, however, couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong, and he had a sinking feeling inside. Hans Hansen, a Dane, was heading off to Bulawayo with his wife, Diana, to see some old friends. Hans was quite right to worry. Below him, there was a Zipra missile team intently watching the plane. The previous plane, the Mazoe, had passed by merely 15 minutes earlier, but inexplicably, the terrorists hadn't fired their Strela missile. Flight 825, the Hanyani, was not to be so lucky. The flight passed overhead, and the infrared eye of the missile launcher locked onto the massive aircraft. The indicator lamp turned from red to green, and the operator squeezed down on the trigger. The missile slammed into the wheel bay of the Hanyani, near the edge of engine number 3's exhaust. Hans Hansen recalled, quote, "The plane shook, and there was a loud explosion as fire poured out of the inner starboard engine. The flames extended the whole length of the plane to the tail fin, like a gigantic acetylene welding flame. I wondered if it was possible with such heat to land the aircraft before the wing melted and fell off. We turned in a full circle while descending sharply," end quote. He continued, quote, "No one screamed or panicked. An elderly man emerged from his seat asking for a fire extinguisher. No one answered him, but it was a sensible request. Diana took my hand and we sat still. Everything seemed to be very still and silent. Quietly, I thought, God, "I have not found out everything I want to know. I am not ready to die." End quote. The passengers were in capable hands. Captain John Hood and First Officer Garth Beaumont, despite the chaos, desperately managed to get the spiraling aircraft under control. Hood announced over the radio that the plane was under control and that they were going to make a crash landing. The passengers were told to empty their pockets, take their shoes off, and hold their ankles. A long, open field was needed for this near impossible task, given that the aircraft was going at a speed of 250 kilometers per hour. The plane was currently over the Woomera Hills, on which subsistence farmers lived off the land on small plots. Not the best place to find a long open field, but Hood refused to give up. He soon spotted an old cotton field with the dimensions of about 2 football fields combined. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only piece of open ground in the hilly, heavily wooded area, and it would give the Hunyani a chance at least. The air hostesses told the passengers to fasten their seatbelts and adopt the crash position before rushing off to their own seats and taking their own advice. Hood then spoke to his passengers for the last time and told them to brace for impact and keep their heads down. Hans recalled, quote, "Automatically obeying the captain and squeezing Diana's hand, I somehow also saw tree branches passing the window, and then things turned black." End quote. Captain John Hood had judged the landing absolutely perfectly, and the aircraft brushed through the treetops. In a cruel twist of fate, however, 2 tall trees snagged the drooping right wing and tore off a portion of the wingtip. The plane rolled sharply to the right, and the torn edge of the wing was the first part of the plane to hit the ground. Ian Pringle writes in Murder in the Zambezi, quote, "After shedding bits on the way, the wing and propellers plowed into the gully, and the aircraft continued to roll until it was laterally vertical, as described by accident investigations. The wing smashed into the far right side of the donga, which caused the Viscount to cartwheel and slew around, almost facing the way it had come from. There was no chance for John Hood and Garth Beaumont. They were killed instantly, as were some of the passengers in the front rows." End quote. The ruptured fuel tanks had spread burning fuel all over the crash site, and the fire made a forward escape impossible. Those near the front of the plane were quickly overwhelmed by the flames, and the inferno began to spread towards the survivors trapped further back. From the back of the plane, Hans could see the unfortunate souls being burnt to death, many of them still stuck in their seats, unable to break free. Cheryl Tilley was another who was lucky enough to be right at the back. She managed to prise the escape window open and helped a boy with a broken leg to get out. Hans, meanwhile, spotted a crack in the fuselage, and with the help of another man, Tony Hill, they ripped open a big enough hole to escape out of. Hans then stood on the wing, which, obviously, was still packed with fuel, and began hauling people out, including 3 children. Tony carried them all down to safety, and Diana was helping to carry the children to the hole. It was all one great race against the fire, and the adults were putting their own safety aside for the sake of the children. The fire soon reached the hole, and Diana recalled one horrifying moment. Quote, "There was a lady with her hair on fire who gave me her child and asked me to take the child, which I did, and eventually we got a few people out." End quote. One old man simply fell to the floor and asked Hans to let him die. The brave Dane simply picked the old man up and took him 30 meters away, clear of the fire and the imminent explosion. Hans then rushed back to the plane and couldn't see his wife Diana anywhere, and panic swept over him. He need not have worried. She was still there, just inside the hole, not caring about her own safety, with yet another child in her arms. Her skirt had caught fire, but she simply ripped it off and clambered out. She remarked, quote, "It's too late for the rest. They are all on fire. Get away from here." End quote. She was to be the last one to escape. Her bravery had very nearly doomed her. On her way out, she wrapped Hans' shirt around her as a makeshift skirt, and they carried away one of the injured air hostesses with a crushed leg. The poor woman, drifting in and out of consciousness, kept asking repetitively, quote, "Did we get all the passengers out? Did we get all the passengers out?" End quote. A few minutes later, the wing exploded in a mushroom fireball. 18 people had survived, 16 passengers and both of the air hostesses. The latter 2 had been covered with shards of glass from the bar trolley upon impact and were badly injured. Most of them owed their lives to the Hansons, but all of them owed their lives to John Hood and Garth Beaumont. If the pilots had failed to gain control of the aircraft or missed the field, then there would have been no survivors at all. The 18 survivors weren't out of it yet, however. The nearest location with a police and military presence from which a rescue could be launched was Kuroi, 83 kilometers to the east. Worst of all, it was getting dark. The plane had crashed at 5:16 p.m., 42 minutes before sunset. The hilly region in which the plane had crashed in was also classified as tribal trust land, that being prime territory for terrorists. Zipra forces were indeed very active in the Arungwe and neighbouring Kanyati tribal trust lands, where they survived by demanding food and supplies from the local subsistence farmers. The survivors came to terms with their situation and emerged from their shock. They now had to actually get rescued. Hans, who served part-time in the police reserve, knew full well that there wouldn't be any Rhodesian Air Force helicopters arriving to save them until after dark. The realization that they almost certainly wouldn't be getting rescued that evening seemed to ignite some kind of human instinct for survival. Those who were fit to do so began tending to the injured and got themselves organized. One survivor, named Cecil McLaren, stated that the most important thing was to get water before dark, and he pointed out that he had seen a small village nearby. This was good news, considering the nearby Matusadona National Park was renowned for having the largest lion population in the country and the second highest concentration of lions in the entire world. These predators tended to steer clear of the nearby permanent human settlements. Cecil headed off for the village along with Sharon and Tracy Cole and Rob and Shannon Hargreaves. The village seemed deserted, but Cecil was fluent in Shona, so he shouted out for the villagers, and soon enough they appeared from their hiding places and reluctantly gave him the water and containers he requested. The villagers' reluctance was rather ominous and could only mean one thing. Terrorists had obviously been around recently, or were still present in the area. If they were caught giving help to the white man, then they would be put down like they were nothing for being supposed sellouts. The Hansons, meanwhile, went to the other side of the wreckage and began searching through the debris and suitcases for blankets and bandages for the wounded. Hans recalled, quote, "As we left the group of survivors, a young teenage girl followed us a few paces, explaining that she now could not pay her taxes because her income tax returns had gone up in smoke. It was obvious she was suffering from shock. Close to the fuselage, which was still burning, we saw a pretty little Asian girl dead on the ground, her face like a doll. She must have been thrown out during the crash," end quote. The couple continued on to see if there was a suitable area for a rescue helicopter to land. Then, suddenly, they heard voices coming from the opposite direction to the survivors, and Hans spotted shadows moving quickly in the long grass. He continued his account, quote, "We had just begun walking back when a burst of machine gun fire opened up on us and in the direction of the surviving passengers," end quote. The Hansons hit the deck, and the wild firing stopped, and was followed by single shots as the terrorists approached a huddle of 10 survivors. Hans remembered hearing one shout, quote, "We are your friends, but you have stolen our land. We will kill you. Give us your valuables," end quote. Tony Hill was another survivor who had gone to look for clothes to make bandages, and he was now making his way back to the others. He recalled, quote, "I was walking over toward them, and when I was halfway between the survivors and the plane, I heard voices just over to my left, and I turned to see where the voices were coming from. And they just opened up on me, and I just saw red tracer flying all over, and cracks as the bullets went past me. I dived into the ground, and bullets were hitting all around me, so I got up and ran. And they shot at me all the way up the slope until I got over the top and ran down a short slope where there was a little gully at the bottom, which I jumped into and lay up against the bank. I thought they would find me, but maybe I could grab one when he came over the top of the gully," end quote. Tony didn't need to worry. The terrorists preferred more vulnerable targets. The terrorists assured the survivors that they would bring them help and water, and then demanded that they move to a place 50 meters away. Hans overheard the terrorists demanding that the able-bodied carry the injured, and he could hear an old woman desperately pleading for the savages to spare the children. In response, the whites were bombarded with political nonsense. The terrorists refused to wait or to be pleaded with. In an act of unspeakable brutality, they then opened up at point-blank range on the defenseless group of survivors. Tony Hill recalls, quote, "I hadn't lain there for more than 4 or 5 minutes, and I just heard a terrific burst of firing, and then short little bursts afterwards, as they obviously finished off anybody who might still be moving," end quote. The victims included all of the children which Diana Hansen had bravely rescued from the burning aircraft. One of them was Cheryl Tilley, brother of Colin Tilley, who had been shot dead 9 months earlier in the farm attack near Salisbury, which had shocked the nation. Hans, horrified at what was taking place right next to him, attempted to stand up to negotiate with the terrorists. Diana, thinking far more prudently, grabbed him and pulled him back down, hissing at him to stay put. She had saved both of their lives. Cecil McLaren's group of 5 were also heading back to the crash site as the chaos broke out. As they carried their water, they heard the voices and then the shooting. The bullets then started flying through the trees near them, and they instinctively ran off into the bush. Cecil got everyone into a dry riverbed, where they tried to wait out the night. For hours, they heard footsteps, but everyone understood what they had to do, and they kept very quiet. One girl in the group was 4-year-old Tracy Cole, who listened absolutely fabulously and stayed perfectly still. McLaren recalled, quote, "You couldn't have had a better kid than Tracy," end quote. Tracy's mother, Sharon, would quite rightly heap praise on Cecil McLaren for saving their lives later. Elsewhere, Tony Hill waited out the night, and he had no idea that the Hansons or the McLaren group had survived as well. There were 8 survivors now, in total. After massacring the wounded and those accompanying them, the terrorists had scurried off, terrified of the rapid airborne response they expected from the Rhodesian security forces. The Hansons sought some better cover for the evening, and watched as the villagers arrived and began to ransack the site, scavenging from it whatever they could find, and simply leaving the bodies for the buzzards. As he laid there, Hans reflected on how he felt less angered towards the brutal killers than towards, quote, "my fellow citizens of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and others who gleefully support the communist revolutionaries with material support and financial assistance," end quote. At around midnight, another group of armed men turned up and sat next to the body of one of the air hostesses, which the previous group had executed. Hans recalled hearing lots of commotion and rattling, and one man got so close that the Hansons could see his boots. It was a close call, but eventually the mysterious men left, and everyone continued to wait out the freezing evening. Hans again, quote, "I had no shirt on, and Diana only had my shirt wrapped around her and a light blouse. We froze, and my jaw moved uncontrollably. I was making a noise from my chattering teeth. I turned to try and control my jaw, and eventually found that lying on my back and lifting my neck at a 45-degree angle, I could control the chattering, but with no support under my back or head, it was a very tiring position," end quote. Sunrise came at 6:09 a.m., and Cecil McLaren's group headed east, a high-risk strategy indeed, given that this was terrorist and lion country. Cecil later reported to the Rhodesia Herald, quote, "All along the way we came across hostile people. No, I wouldn't say hostile. They were obviously very frightened. Whenever I went up to a kraal, I would say, if you can help, okay. If you can't, okay," end quote. It wasn't until 9 a.m. that the Hansons heard the first sounds of a rescue aircraft. 5 minutes later, a Dakota passed overhead, turned back around, and began dropping paratroopers. They were saved. SAS Commander Garth Barrett, one of the initial 3 paratroopers to arrive on the scene, recalls his horror. Quote, "I could see this group of people lying underneath a tree. I remember one girl's yellowish dress stood out, but they were lying down and nobody was moving. It was a very ugly scene. What was immediately apparent to me was that the survivors had been all gathered together and shot at close range, evidenced by the gunpowder burns on the bodies. I saw no evidence of bayonet wounds. One elderly guy had Rhodesian dollar notes sticking out of the pocket of his short-sleeved shirt, which meant the terrorists did not bother to take the money," end quote. Lieutenant Darrell Watt was also on the site. He recalled that he was used to seeing death, but, quote, "Nothing I had seen or done prepared me for what was in front of me. I think it was the dead children that destroyed me emotionally," end quote. Shortly after landing, the Hansons emerged from the bush and explained all they had seen. Tony Hill then also appeared and shared his side. The group, led by Cecil McLaren, were picked up by a rescue convoy of Land Rovers shortly afterwards. All 3 of the survivors on site were convinced that no bayoneting had taken place from what they could see. The bodies, however, had indeed been bayoneted. The dead Asian girl that Hans had seen earlier was one such example. She now had a gaping bayonet hole in her head. It was quickly established that during the night, yet another group had visited the site and began bayoneting the bodies after dark. Who and why was never established, but the trio were lucky to be alive. The Hansons and Tony Hill were whisked off by helicopter to Kariba Hospital, where they were swamped by the international press. What they had to say shocked the nation. Everyone was on the edge of their seats, waiting to find out what on earth had happened to that plane. The first news to seep out suggested that there was no survivors. Then there was news that a helicopter had picked up a few survivors. Despair quickly turned to hope. It was all very cruel. Hans recalls his trip to the hospital. Quote, "Being back in Kariba was like coming out of a sleeping nightmare. The last 18 hours seemed unreal. In the hospital, we bathed, and our minor cuts were attended to. Bruno was overwhelmed to see us, as were Ulrich and Annette. They had heard that a helicopter had brought 3 survivors to Kariba Hospital, only 3 out of 56 passengers and crew. I saw the glow on their faces as they entered the hospital room and their gratitude that we had been spared. But I also saw others who turned away with uncontrollable tears, their loved ones butchered or burnt to unrecognizable ashes, never to be hugged or kissed again. My heart cried out for them." End quote. It was at mid-afternoon that the actual news was broadcast to the nation in a statement by Air Rhodesia. The names of the 8 survivors were read out, and then the bad news was read out. Quote, "Unfortunately, there are no further survivors. The bodies of the deceased will be brought to Salisbury for identification." End quote. It was especially harsh for Bulawayo. Not one of the 19 passengers bound for Bulawayo had survived. The worst losses to stomach were Betty Trinder and her 2 little grandchildren, the only children of her daughter. The scenes at the Andrew Fleming Hospital in Salisbury were absolutely harrowing, as the family set about their awful task of identifying the bodies. It was all made so much worse, with the knowledge that most of the victims in the morgue had actually survived the initial crash. It was on the Tuesday morning that the full story came out. The Herald ran the headline on that day, the 5th of September, quote, "18 live through plane crash horror. Then, terrorists killed 10 survivors, shot at point-blank range." End quote. Every source or recollection of events stresses the sheer level of anger that now swept the nation. Many simply explain that it was indescribable. At this point, the public didn't even know how the plane itself had come down, and the anger amongst the people was already at boiling point just from the massacre afterwards. What came next took things to an entirely new level. Later on that Tuesday, Joshua Nkomo, leader of ZAPU and co-leader of the Patriotic Front with Mugabe, came out and took responsibility. Quote, "We brought that plane down, but it is not true that we killed any survivors. The Rhodesians have been ferrying military personnel and equipment in Viscounts, and we had no reason to believe that this was anything different. The Rhodesians should know this is a military zone." End quote. He then, typically, tried playing the race card. Quote, "You forget that the regime kills 30 of our people a day, so the life of a black person is different from a white person." End quote. Nkomo's remark about the massacre on the ground not being his forces was obviously nonsense. The 30 of his people killed per day were savage terrorists who only existed to target civilians. The innocents on the flight, meanwhile, had never done anything wrong to anybody. They were mostly women and children. Some of them weren't even white, they were Asian. A BBC Radio 4 announcer called Nkomo up to test his claim, and here is where the anger really boiled over. Nkomo was asked how exactly the plane had been brought down, and he then began to laugh at the tragedy. The civilians, he argued, were valid military targets. His logic was that the males on board could have been territorial reservists. His giggling reply was broadcast immediately in Rhodesia, and the entire nation wanted his head on a platter. The anger was simply incomprehensible. Some of this emotion quickly turned ugly, and random blacks were beaten up in the streets in a few cases. Despite being in the middle of a war, such scenes were unheard of. Blacks had been massacring white women and children for years now, but this was when the white man decided it was time to fight back. They simply couldn't hold back anymore. Rob Gaunt, a Rhodesian Front MP, famously remarked, quote, "I believe we have done our utmost in this country to be reasonable, and the time, I fear, is now upon us when all Africa is going to see their first race of really angry white men." End quote. Jeffrey Nyarota, one of the few black reporters at the Herald, wrote about the night when the sub-editors were processing the news of the Viscount murders. Quote, "This wicked massacre shocked the entire nation and the world. Black and white united in condemnation of the shooting down of Flight 825 and the senseless loss of innocent lives. Reports that ZAPU leader Joshua Nkomo had laughed about the incident were met with utter revulsion. There was mayhem in the Herald newsroom that night. As the gravity of events at Kariba sank in, seasoned journalists manning the all-white subs desk rose up as one in a storm of protest, cursing the communist terrorists and everything that was either black or African." End quote. On the Thursday, it was positively confirmed that a Strela warhead had indeed taken down the plane. Co-Minister of Transport Bill Irvine interrupted normal parliamentary procedure and announced the news and stated, quote, "The people of this country will not let these innocents go unavenged. Our security forces, black and white together, are at present hunting down the murder gang, and I can promise the leaders of the Patriotic Front skulking in Lusaka and elsewhere that those who seek to ride the wind will reap the whirlwind, end quote. Another member of parliament shouted out that the perpetrators should be hung publicly. Smith, especially, was furious. Merely days beforehand, the news had leaked of his secret meeting with Nkomo in the Zambian capital of Lusaka. Nkomo had been promised to take over as head of the interim government preceding a general election, and his Zipra army would combine with the Rhodesian security forces, UN and Commonwealth forces to keep the peace. The British, Nigerian and Zambian governments had all sponsored the deal. Nkomo was getting pretty much the best deal he could possibly hope for on a plate, and Smith was willing to put his head on the line for it. Now, of course, that was all gone. Nkomo had committed one of the most heinous acts in recent history. There could be no working with that monster. Smith, however, still urged restraint. He wrote in his memoirs, quote, "So it was necessary, although difficult, to counsel cool heads and remind people that two wrongs do not make a right," end quote. The Anglican Bishop of Mashonaland also tried speaking along these lines, quote, "I arrived back to the dreadful and soul-searing news of the Viscount atrocities, and the thing that I fear most now is a white backlash. It takes the greatest courage of all to realize the hopelessness of revenge and the importance of conciliation. It is terribly important that the ghastliness of the war does not brutalize us, especially the whites, and blunt our sensibilities to the fact that the most grievous suffering is still among the defenseless people in the tribal trust lands," end quote. Smith and the bishop's words of restraint, however, quite rightly, fell on deaf ears. There was no chance on planet Earth that the Rhodesians would let this act of terror go unpunished. The PM's hands were tied. There could be no more worrying about what South Africa would think. In a way, there was to be no more logic and thinking himself out of action. If Smith did not act, he would risk being ousted in a full-scale revolt by his own party. There would be no more Nkomo talks, and there would be revenge. He simply had no choice. The Rhodesian people demanded it. On the 8th of September, the Friday, flags all across Rhodesia were flown at half-mast, and major memorial services were held at Salisbury's Anglican Cathedral, the Hebrew congregation, and at the Hindu temple. The Anglican service, obviously, was by far the biggest. 2,000 mourners packed into the cathedral. Every inch of space was occupied, even the steps of the font. 500 more gathered around radios on the pavements outside. Everyone who was anyone in Rhodesia was there. John da Costa, the Anglican Dean of Salisbury, condemned the murder of the survivors as, quote, "the most savage and treacherous sort, which leaves us stunned with disbelief and brings revulsion in the minds of anyone deserving the name human. This bestiality, worse than anything in recent history, stinks in the nostrils of heaven. But are we deafened with the voice of protest from nations which call themselves civilized? We are not. Like men in the story of the Good Samaritan, they pass by on the other side," end quote. He was quite right, and da Costa went on to point out that not a single world leader had said a word about the massacre. The Pope, Jimmy Carter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Chief Rabbi, the British Prime Minister, none of them had said a word. The Dean even went on to blame the atrocity partly on the UN and the World Council of Churches. Quote, "I am sure they both bear blame on this. Each parade a pseudo-morality, which, like all half-truths, is more dangerous than the direct lie. I have nothing but sadness that our churches have failed so badly to practice what we teach. May God forgive us all, and may he bring all those who died so suddenly and unprepared into the light of his glorious presence. Amen," end quote. The service went down really well. It was powerful stuff, and added even more to the emotion welling up within the country. As the spectators left the cathedral, they were confronted with many protesters who were furious at Ian Smith for daring to meet with Nkomo just days beforehand. They confronted Smith himself when it was his turn to come out. One father of four held up a poster that read, quote, "PM Smith, give Nkomo a message when you next meet him secretly. Go to hell, you murdering bastard," end quote. Smith continued to use soft language and would have been very frustrated that his talks had imploded. A week after the tragedy, Smith made a low-key radio and television address. Quote, "I must warn the neighboring states to the north and to the east that we cannot tolerate a situation in which these murderous terrorists can operate from within their borders with impunity. If they permit this, then they must bear the consequences of any defensive strikes we may undertake against terrorist bases in their country," end quote. The kid gloves, reluctantly or not, were coming off. The Zambians quickly got the hint and appealed to Britain, asking them to restrain Smith from launching any strikes in their country. Smith was also once again invited for talks, this time in an open letter by the semi-official Times of Zambia newspaper. No matter what the Zambian president said though, it could not distract from the reality Zambia was harboring and helping thousands of terrorists and allowing them to freely infiltrate Rhodesia across her border to commit atrocities. The Hawks had finally got what they wanted. Revenge had to be taken. There could, however, be no question of rushing it. This had to be done properly, and planning began right away. Special Branch produced a report which was based on the best intelligence they had at the time. The report put the number of terrorists in Zambia at around 17,500, and the main camps where they were being housed and trained were identified as Freedom Camp, Mubaroma, and the CGT complexes. Freedom Camp housed Nkomo's military high command and his central communications center. The complex was built around what had previously been the white-owned farmstead called Westlands Farm, just 19 kilometers north of Lusaka's city center. Special Branch estimated that there were 4,558 terrorists here, and 300 of them were observed to be on permanent guard duty in a trench system surrounding the complex. Reconnaissance photos also revealed several anti-aircraft gun emplacements. Umboroma, meanwhile, was located 160 kilometers northeast of Lusaka on the banks of the Makushi River. This one was somewhat of a mystery. An indirect source estimated that 1,500 terrorists were housed at the complex and that it was divided into two parts, one for trained guerrillas and the other for trainees. Photo reconnaissance revealed that the camp here at Makushi was indeed a large and very active camp. Finally, there was the CGT complexes. This simply stood for Central Guerrilla Training Camps in Zipper terminology, and there were 4 separate camps covering an area of 30 square kilometers between the Chakawenga and Rufunsa rivers along the road which connects Zambia with Malawi. The Rhodesians numbered the camps 2, 3, 4, and 5. CGT-2 was the largest and was estimated to house 4,000 guerrillas. CGT-3 had an estimated population of 1,000 fully trained guerrillas who had returned from Angola, Ethiopia, and Russia. There was very little information regarding CGTs 4 and 5. All in all, it was estimated that the 3 main identified targets between them could contain over 11,000 guerrillas, around 2/3 of Nkomo's forces in Zambia. The planners got to work on formulating a broad attack plan on the 3 bases. It was to go by the name Operation Gatling. For now, though, the focus was on another operation, Operation Snoopy. 2.5 weeks after the Hunyani went down, soldiers of the SAS and the RLI were taken to Salisbury for a briefing. To their surprise, Captain Scotty McCormick of the SAS pointed to a target in Mozambique, not Zambia. The target was near Mugabe's old military headquarters, which had been obliterated in Operation Dingo the year before. Mugabe had learnt his lesson and dispersed his forces into smaller, well-defended clusters over a very wide area. Special Branch had learned from captured Zanla terrorists that 2,000 of their comrades were residing in an area called the Chamoy Circle, and they were waiting here for the rains to begin in November so they could infiltrate Rhodesia. Hitting the Ters now, in September, the height of the dry season, was an opportunity not to be wasted. The attack was launched on the 20th of September and resulted in a series of small skirmishes. The entire operation was somewhat of a non-event. It was evident that Zanla had already abandoned the area and moved elsewhere. All that remained was a small caretaker group. As the disappointed Rhodesians began pulling out, an Air Force aircraft came under heavy fire. The plan quickly changed, and the Rhodesians were deployed to the source of the firing. That source was a new complex, unknown to Rhodesian intelligence, which was huge and consisted of various small camps surrounded by well-defended trenches. Anti-aircraft weapons littered the area. The result was predictable and ended the same way as pretty much every other Rhodesian operation. Hundreds of terrorists were killed, but very little was achieved strategically. 1 South African and 1 Rhodesian lost their lives, and 2 Rhodesian jets were hit by Strela missiles. Both jets managed to get away just fine. Regardless, the Rhodesians could now focus on Operation Gatling. Smith and his black colleagues, meanwhile, set off for a 2-week-long public relations tour of the US on the 6th of October. The goal was to persuade the Americans to end sanctions. Smith's message was simple. As he put it, quote, "We have done all the Americans ever asked us to do. All we are going to do is say that we have done it, and what more do you want?" End quote. A date had finally been chosen for Gatling. That was the 19th of October. It was reported that Nkomo and his high command would be visiting Freedom Camp that day. The target was simply too tempting. It was decided to hit all 3 targets in one day. Freedom Camp at 8:30 am, Makushi at 11:45 am, and the CGT complexes at 3 pm. With Freedom Camp being so close to Lusaka, it was decided not to use ground forces. If the Zambian Defense Force was on the ball, then they could react swiftly and really bog the Rhodesians down. Extraction via slow-moving Alouette helicopters would also prove incredibly dangerous. Makushi was to be vertically enveloped by paratroopers and heli troops. The ground assault was to be an all-SAS affair. The CGT complexes were to be hit by air only, except for CGT-2, which would be vertically enveloped by the RLI. On the morning of the 19th of October, there were 4 English electric Canberra bombers on the northern apron at New Sarum Air Force Base. Ground technicians and armourers were swarming around the machines, preparing them for their big flight. The weather, too, was playing her part. October is the hottest month of the year in that part of the world, and the skies were clear, perfect for bombing. 300 Alpha bomblets were loaded into the belly of each of the Canberras. When the planes were ready, squadron leader Chris Dixon, 3 other pilots, and 4 navigators made their way out of the crew room and strode over to their aircrafts. This was Green Section. Chris, famously, was to go by Green Leader. The lads did their pre-takeoff checks, and Frank Mussel, commander of the Rhodesian Air Force, came to see them off. As Green Section took off, Mike Rohn, Dixon's navigator, noted down the time. It was exactly 7:45 am. 2 better men could not have been chosen for the job. Everyone had known someone, or known someone that knew someone, that had died in the Hunyani crash. Chris, however, was a school friend of John Hood, the heroic pilot. The two had been fellow first-team cricketers at the elite Plumtree School together. This was personal. Mike, too, had gone to the same school as Dolce Esterhuizen, the flight attendant who had been so mercilessly shot after surviving the crash. At exactly the same time as the Canberras took off, squadron leader Graham Cronshaw lifted his Alouette helicopter gunship off the ground and was followed by the other 3 K-cars, as they were known. The gunships were to have the task of mopping up the target and further directing jet strikes if needed. They were to arrive at the edge of Freedom Camp 3 minutes after the Canberras had dropped their bombs. They had been ordered to load up with 500 pounds of fuel and to carry the standard amount of 20mm ammunition. These orders were ignored. 650 pounds of fuel was taken along with extra ammunition. Again, this was personal. They wanted to stick around and do as much damage as they could, even if it was dangerous. Green Section continued on towards their target. Rohn had rigged up a cassette tape recorder to the intercom system that would record the discussions between him and Dixon, as well as the radio dialogue. This turned out to be a prudent choice. The Green Leader tape would end up becoming perhaps the most famous recording of its kind of all time. Blue Section, too, were also on their way with their Hunter jets. Their route took them right by Kariba Airport, which they could clearly see on their left. On the right, meanwhile, they could see the Woomera Hills, where the wreckage of the Viscount they were off to avenge was laying. As Green Section approached Zambia, their breathing grew much heavier over the recording, and their speech became much more clipped. Shortly before crossing the Zambezi, the Hunters caught up with them and joined the formation. "We are crossing the stream now," Dixon reported over the radio. It was 8:17 am. There was a lot of turbulence that day, and the rickety old Canberras were really feeling it. Their maximum speed was supposed to be 250 knots in such conditions, but soon they would have to fly at their bombing speed of 310. "Ah shit, I hope these fucking wings don't fall off," Dixon cursed over the radio. The terrorists at Freedom Camp, meanwhile, were lined up on the parade ground. Just after 8 am, their camp commander addressed them, but then left without dismissing them. The fairly well-disciplined Zipper guerrillas were simply left standing there, holding their SKS rifles at ease as they waited for their leaders to appear or for them to be dismissed. In the skies above them, the Canberras and Hunters had once more gone their separate ways as they crossed the Great East Road, which links Lusaka to Malawi. The Canberras were slow and merely needed to stay straight and level for their bombing runs. The Hunters, meanwhile, needed to dive down steeply towards their targets. The window between the two was to be very short, and the timing had to be perfect. The Hunters would drop their bombs and pull out at about 3,000 feet. The Canberras, meanwhile, were dropping their bombs from only 300 feet. The Hunters were beginning to dive, and so the Green Section began to accelerate, and they opened up their bomb doors. Rohn held the bomb release control firmly in his hand, ready for action. Down below, the terrorists only got their first inkling that something was wrong when the first Hunter had already entered its dive. It was too late to flee. A 1,000-pound fragmentation bomb and a collection of golf bombs slammed into the parade square. Deadly shrapnel and a massive shockwave were sent in all directions. The ear-shattering explosion and then implosion of the golf bomb stunned any survivors in the blast radius, and the rest of the guerrillas began to instinctively run away from the buildings and the carnage on the parade ground. Norris Donga, a terrorist survivor, recalled, quote, "It comes like lightning. We just heard a bomb hit the ground. Everybody started running away. I saw my other comrades, some falling in front of me, being bombed," end quote. Tony Oakley, Blue 2, was next, and he aimed for the communications building. Baldy Baldwin, Blue 3, recalled, quote, "In my dive, I saw the building Tony Oakley was aiming for just disappear as his bombs hit it," end quote. Blue 3's bombing run followed so soon afterwards that he ended up with a massive gash on his aircraft, from the air brake to the tail section. This was caused by half of the nose cone from either his own or Oakley's 1,000-pound bomb. A close call indeed. Baldy would later recall, quote, "It is possible that I went too low in my dive. Maybe I spent too much time looking at Tony's blast, and not enough focus on my own. Anyway, I have a 2.5-kilogram trophy in my lounge as a memento of Operation Gatling," end quote. The helpless terrorists below continued to flee for the tree cover to the northeast. They were running straight into the path of the approaching Canberras. Dixon and Roan could see the chaos from their cockpit and were excitedly shouting about how effective the hunters had been. Roan recalled what they saw below them. There were just hundreds and hundreds of people running away from the buildings across an open field where there was a rudimentary football pitch towards their living quarters to the east, and I assume it was instinctive because that is where they had come from, and that's where they would run to, and it was apparent there would be bombing right in the midst of them, end quote. The Canberra's turn was merely seconds away. Roan's voice was by now quivering with adrenaline. He shouted out,
"Lift the touch. Steady. 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 Confirm switching doors open."
Yes, switching doors.
Steady. Roger, touch. I've got them in the field. Steady. I'm going to get them.
Yes.
Steady.
Fucking beautiful.
Steady. Steady. Now. Bomb's gone. They're running.
It was ever so tempting for Roan to press the release button, but he held his discipline for a few more seconds for maximum effect. At the opportune moment, he let it rip, and 1,200 deadly alpha bombs came raining down from the 4 Canberras and carpeted the field below with shrapnel. Dixon shouted out,
Beautiful! Jesus Christ, you want to see all those fuckers? The fucking bombs are beautiful. Fucking beautiful. Oh, Jeff, I'm just going to continue on this thing.
Oh, they're running straight into the other frags.
Yeah, I know.
Beautiful.
The ordeal for the terrorists below was not over yet. Blythewood was repositioning his hunter behind the Canberras for round 2. He lined up on the trenches and anti-aircraft pits and opened up on them with his lethal 30mm cannons. The rest of Blue Section followed suit. Strangely enough, there seemed to have been no anti-aircraft fire whatsoever during the entire attack. The terrorists simply hadn't been prepared. The K cars now moved in and began firing at the fleeing mass of black bodies. Keith Spence recalls of his mission, quote, "Because the intelligence photos showed plenty of anti-aircraft weapon sites, we moved in at 1,500 feet instead of our usual attack orbit of 800 feet. There were people running everywhere, and we came under heavy small arms fire, mainly from the guards near the main gate. But thankfully, there was no anti-aircraft fire. And this was because the heavy weapons on the photo reconnaissance pictures turned out to be dummies. We saw a group of men dive into a Peugeot, and my gunner took it and them out," end quote. There were plenty of issues for the K cars. There was frequent stoppages caused by the hot cannon barrels. The gunners were supposed to fire double-tap short bursts to keep the barrels cool, but as Spence put it, quote, "Because we were over the target for only about 8 minutes, the guys got a bit carried away," end quote. As the K cars kept up their turkey shoot, Chris Dixon got around to delivering his infamous message to the air traffic control tower at Lusaka Airport.
Tower, this is Green Leader. This is a message for the station commander at Mumbai from the Rhodesian Air Force. We are attacking the terrorist base at Westlands Farm at this time. This attack is against Rhodesian dissidents and not against Zambia. Rhodesia has no quarrel, repeat, no quarrel with Zambia or her security forces. We therefore ask you not to intervene or oppose our attack. However, we are orbiting your airfield at this time and are under orders to shoot down any Zambian Air Force aircraft which does not comply with this request and attempts to take off. Did you copy all that?
Copied.
Roger, thanks. Cheers.
Ian Pringle writes in his book, Green Leader, quote, "The controller had fully understood the message. It emerged many years later that he had indeed been tempted to activate the MiGs at Mombourg, but Dixon's commanding voice had induced him to cooperate. As a result, no Zambian Air Force jets were scrambled, despite the gross violation of Zambian airspace." End quote. 7 minutes after the bombs had been dropped, the K-cars began to run out of ammunition and headed for home. Finally, it was time for the Hunter pair of White Section to have their turn. After they got confirmation that the K-cars were clear, they swooped in and attacked the headquarters building and Radio Shack with napalm to burn anything that was still standing. As everyone headed for home, Green Leader kept Lusaka Tower updated and made sure that no aircraft took off before they had made their escape. As he got out of range, he passed over to Dolphin 3, who kept up communication with the Zambians. Red Section, which had been patrolling the Zambian Air Force base at Mombourg, made a beeline for Freedom Camp so they could have a turn of their own before heading back home. Alf Wild recalls, quote, "We routed home to Flied, as ordered by the command DAC, via FC Camp, where we expended our 68mm Matra rockets on anything we saw still intact." End quote. Once Red Section was clear, Norman Walsh radioed Lusaka Tower, quote, "Our task is complete, and we are leaving the area. And, I repeat, we have no quarrel with Zambia or her security forces, or any civilian traffic, and I would like to thank you very much indeed for your cooperation." End quote. The attack had gone off without a hitch. Freedom Camp had been obliterated, and the terrorists had been sitting ducks. There were no losses at all on the Rhodesian side. Their job, of course, was not finished. Everyone rushed back to base to refuel, rearm, and repair, so they were ready for Phase 2. Makushi was to be subjected to an airstrike even larger than the one that had just hit Freedom Camp. On top of that, 165 paratroopers and heli-troopers of the SAS would then vertically envelop the camp. The man chosen to lead this attack was Major Garth Barrett, the SAS commander who had been the first man on the ground at the Hanyani crash site. In Salisbury, the paratroopers made their way to New Sarum Air Base and prepared to board their Dakotas. Amongst them was 62-year-old Stan Standish, who had heard about the operation and knew that he didn't want to miss out, so he talked his way into joining. Standish was an Arnhem veteran, and rumour had it that as he was about to board, he was asked by General Wools if anyone else on the raid had been at Arnhem. Standish replied, quote, "Only the bloody aircraft, sir," end quote. Peter Wools was nowhere near the scene at the time, and was on board his command Dakota miles away, but regardless, it was a funny story that did the rounds, and may have contained a grain of truth. At 9:25 AM, all the troops were on board, and the pilots started up their engines before taking off and heading to link up with the rest of the assault force without any problems. Each Dakota helicopter held 20 paratroopers and 5 aircrew. Those at Makushi, all 1,889 of them, were none the wiser about what was about to hit them, and they left their defense pits unmanned. The battle didn't get off to the best of starts. As the Canberras approached, Mike Rohn realized that he was too far north of it and elected not to waste the bombs. He recalled, quote, "It was the first time that I ever missed my target, and the first time we didn't release the bombs. And with the vampires attacking behind us, there was no opportunity to go around and do another run. There was no rancor. Chris Dixon was very understanding as a leader," end quote. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter all that much. Green 3 and 4 dropped their bombs on the southern camp, where most of the trained guerrillas were bunched up. Once again, as the Canberras cleared off, the hunters dived in. The 8 massive golf bomb explosions and implosions caused utter chaos on the ground, and the smoke left behind served as markers for the next wave of strike aircraft, the vampires. At around the same time, the 1st Dakotas began dropping their paratroopers. Below them, the vampires were pounding their targets with their 20mm Hispano high-explosive cannon fire. Behind them were the Lynxes of Hornet Section, which dropped napalm and mini golf bombs over the battlefield. The K-cars then moved in and started picking off the guerrillas as they recovered their senses and ran for cover. The Dakotas had ended up dropping their men a little too close to the target, and as a result, the terrorists were literally running away under the paratroopers' feet, and the men were engaged in firefights from the second they hit the ground. Staff Sergeant Andy Johnston recalls his experience in the lead Dakota, quote, "The Makushi target area was green and looked like an Indonesian tea field. As I landed, I heard the cry, 'Medic, medic.' A newly badged lieutenant, Rob Warren Cordington, was missing 3.5 fingers on his left hand. When you jump from the Dakota, you place your right hand on your reserve chute on your chest, and your left hand on the aircraft door sill, angled down at about 45 degrees, just below hip height, to avoid getting your hand caught in the static line of the person who has just jumped. Rob unfortunately held the door much higher up, and his fingers got caught by a static line as he jumped, end quote. Warren Codrington's first deployment with the SAS hadn't ended at all well. He was a tough man, however, and as soon as his hand had healed, he was back on active SAS operations, despite attempts to give him a desk job. The G cars, which were meant to drop troops on the western side, weren't having the best time either. Pringle writes, quote, "Unfortunately, the G car leader picked the wrong river. Instead of dropping Captain Bob Mackenzie's stop group and the mortar team on the edge of the Makushi River, the party of 24 men had been dropped near another river, at least 5 kilometers short of the intended spot. The error was compounded because, although the pilots and soldiers quickly realized that they were far from the action, the Alouette G cars were too low on fuel to reposition them. So, Hotel 2 and the mortar team had to wait patiently while the G cars flew to the admin base to refuel. Bob Mackenzie, an American national and Vietnam War veteran, was not pleased, to say the least. He knew that while his group was sitting in the middle of nowhere, the entire eastern flank of the target was open. Indeed, many guerrillas saw the gap and took it, including a runner who apparently ran non-stop to Moboroma to raise the alarm, end quote. Regardless, despite everything not going to plan, the Rhodesians were dealing major damage. The element of surprise had remained intact, and many of the terrorist weapons were actually locked up in the armory, so they couldn't even fight back if they wanted to. Some, however, did have their weapons. In one of the early skirmishes, 19-year-old Lance Corporal Jeff Collard of the SAS was shot dead by a female Zipra guerrilla. Shortly afterwards, another SAS trooper was shot in the face by a woman, although this time it wasn't fatal. For the most part, however, most terrorists just ran for their lives. The chaos of it all was simply too much, and they were too traumatized to fight back. The G cars soon returned and repositioned Bob Mackenzie's heli troopers. The northern paratroopers had now since also reached their intended position, and it was time to begin sweeping the terrorists into the trap, and then the noose would be tightened. Barrett recalled, quote, "There wasn't much of a sustained firefight going on, just sporadic firefights erupting here and there. As soon as the battle was stable and the camp was secure, I asked to be put on the ground so I could get an understanding of what the camp was all about. I grabbed a protection helmet to go and find out for myself. The first thing I found was a complete surprise. The camp was mainly full of women. They were all in combat gear and they had weapons with them, but there was nothing in the briefings that led us to believe that this camp was occupied by women," end quote. The photo reconnaissance hadn't shown the endless foxholes either, and the sweep had to be undertaken extremely carefully to make sure there were no nasty surprises. Many of the terrorists had fled to the river and got amongst the reeds, which were also, obviously, very difficult to clear. Andy Johnston was one man who went sweeping from the north. He remembered, quote, "We were not used to being attacked by people in foxholes, and there were foxholes everywhere, and they were nicely camouflaged with bushes over them. I came across 3 foxholes in which there were people armed with SKS rifles with bayonets fitted. We shot them before they could shoot us," end quote. The roadies continued to slowly work their way through the camp, and each and every little firefight went their way. Barrett himself, who had now abandoned his command chopper to get in on the fun, personally eliminated quite a few terrorists. 1,000 terrorists had managed to escape the cordon, but over 400 of them were left dead at Makushi. Untold numbers of Rhodesian civilian lives had been saved. The findings at the site indicated that the women had been specifically trained in urban warfare. Barrett explained the inevitable consequences of this had they been allowed to train. Quote, "We saw fairly sophisticated training programs there. My concern, and that of Special Branch and CIO, was this. Can you imagine 1,500 maids serving in people's houses and then, on a given day, just up sticks and shoot everyone in the house? Imagine the implications of that. It would have been devastating to the population. That idea really rocked me back on my feet because, if that was indeed the plan, it would have had a dramatic effect on the whole of the white population," end quote. The battle at Makushi was over in no time at all. The women had simply been bowled over. The Rhodesian aircraft was already on its way back home to prepare for the third assault of the day on the CGT complexes. The SAS were left stranded, but this was all part of the plan, and they set up their defences and prepared to spend the night at the camp. The CGT complexes were, frankly, massive. There were over 16 in all, but as noted, they were simplified into 4 targets, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5,000 terrorists were expected to be there, although many were trainees who weren't allowed to handle weapons, unless they were on guard duty. Even then, they only got 10 rounds, which were kept in their pocket. The strategy chosen was to mostly focus on CGT-2, the most understood and most populous target. At 2:45 p.m, the 16G cars lifted off from either side of the runway at Mana Pools near the Zambian border. The Canberras Vampires, lynxes, and hunters were also already in the air and en route to the target. The K-cars were on their way from the admin base already set up in Zambia for the previous target. As H-hour approached, that being 3:15 p.m., the 4 Canberras of Green Section were almost at their target. This time, the terrorists were seemingly better prepared. Roan recalled, quote, "It was the third attack of the day, and everyone seemed to have been alerted, and I saw this guy on the ground who had picked us up early, and I could see him tracking us with his 12.7mm gun, but obviously, when you're doing a run-in, you have to hold the aircraft heading. How the hell he missed us, I will never know, and the fire continued for what seemed like eternity, but it was probably only a few seconds," end quote. Despite the distraction of the bullets whizzing past the Canberras, Green Section kept steady, and they were able to watch as the hunters dropped their golf bombs. It wasn't to be as easy as Freedom Camp for Roan. They had picked out the parade ground, but there was no swarm of people running away like last time. Regardless, the alpha bombs were dropped over a wide area right in the middle of the camp, and the Canberras disappeared to the east. The Dakotas and G-cars dropped their men in precisely the right spots, and the K-cars moved in to cover them. Something was evidently wrong, however. The men noticed that the K-cars were not firing. Instead, there was an eerie silence. It quickly became obvious that the camp was deserted, except for 5 Zipra caretakers. Corporal Mike McDonald, one of the paratroopers, recalled, quote, "We parachuted in for the assault and swept into the camp area and found many empty trenches, then some bunkers. So either British, Soviet, or Zipra's own intelligence had pre-warned the camp, and they had packed up and left," end quote. This was all very disappointing for the RLI men, who were spoiling for a fight and had spent all that time preparing. The only real opposition in the area was the anti-aircraft positions. CGT-3, too, was empty. The airstrikes on CGT-4 and 5 were quite the disappointment as well. As Pringle put it, quote, "There was no disguising the fact that the attack on the CGT complexes was a lemon," end quote. The biggest insult of all for the RLI men was the fact that they would now have to spend 2 nights in the deserted camp. The helicopters, the next morning, would be too busy taking members of the press to and from Makushi, and then the SAS were to be extracted first. As the helicopters were turning from Makushi the next morning, they found themselves under heavy flak. A Vampire, a Lynx, and 4 K-cars were sent to sort out what Dick Paxton, a K-car pilot, called, quote, "a rather cheeky gook position," end quote. The Lynx quickly found itself hitting the fuel tank and it had to withdraw. One of the K-cars, too, found itself under heavy fire from a heavy machine gun. It took a direct hit, which caused the tail rotor to fail. The spinning helicopter plunged into the trees, and then to the ground. Sergeant Olofs, the gunner, was hurled clear, but Lieutenant Mark Dawson, the pilot, was pinned into his seat by his flak jacket, which was constricting his throat and slowly suffocating him. Olofs was semi-conscious with a back injury and unable to help his pilot. It was only thanks to a spot of quick thinking from another K-car pilot, Nigel Lamb, that Dawson's life was saved. Lamb landed his helicopter in a clearing, and his technician, Finch Bellringer, ran over and freed Dawson, who had now since turned blue. Olofs made a full recovery, but although Dawson recovered, he was unable to fly again and left the Air Force with a full disability pension. The cheeky gook position, however, did not get the last laugh. The hunters were called in, and they promptly flattened the terrorists once and for all. A group of SAS men were flown in with explosives to destroy the helicopter so it couldn't fall into enemy hands. It was the only aircraft loss of Operation Gatling. There was, however, to be one more battle. The SAS men on Friday the 21st were finally pulling out. Just after the first wave of equipment-laden helicopters left Makushi, a sentry spotted a large party of Zambian army, police, and Zipra approaching. As it turned out, the 1st Zambian Regiment had actually been moved from their base near Victoria Falls to Makushi to keep them safely out of the reach of the Rhodesians. A poor choice. Captain Graham Wilson organized his men into an ambush position, and they were told to wait for his command to fire when the moment was right. One of the SAS men, Andy Johnston, recalled, quote, "It was a classic ambush, where the advantage lay squarely with us on the high ground. As the enemy approached, we waited, and then Graham gave the order to fire, and it was all over in about 3 to 5 minutes," end quote. After those 3 to 5 minutes, there were 37 dead Zambian policemen and soldiers on the ground. 2 prisoners had been taken, and no SAS men had been wounded. A complete success. The 2 prisoners, a Zambian army corporal and a Zipra guerrilla, were taken back to Rhodesia. The Zambian was promptly released and went back across the bridge to Zambia with apologies from the Rhodesian army. The Zipra guerrilla, meanwhile, was quite the catch. As it turned out, he was the army's main logistics officer who went by Mountain Gutu. He was Russian trained and knew many of the top Zipra commanders personally. More importantly, he knew exactly where all the Zipra bases were located. Information he easily gave up to Special Branch. Despite the letdown of the CGT complexes, the entire operation had been a roaring success. Around 1,500 terrorists have been put down. Freedom Camp, and especially the Canberra bombing, saw the biggest body count. The number of terrorists wounded was also ridiculous, around 1,350. 37 Zambians attached to these camps also lost their lives, and a further 198 terrorists had gone missing, presumed dead. The Rhodesians, meanwhile, saw 1 man killed and 3 wounded, 2 of which were from the helicopter crash. Perhaps the most delicious result of all, though, was the cope from Joshua Nkomo afterwards. The obese terrorist leader had already ruined his political career by hitting the Hanyani and massacring the survivors, but now he had the nerve to play the victim when the Rhodesians quite rightly responded. When asked about an all-party conference between all the factions involved in the war on both sides, Nkomo cried out, quote, "We don't talk to murderers, you can forget about the whole damned business," end quote. And regarding the previous talks, quote, "I talked to that savage when I thought there was some humanity in him. I have discovered that he is a beast, a brute, a thief," end quote. Hilariously, he would try to claim that the Rhodesians were licking their wounds after clashing with his guerrillas, and said that his forces had brought down 9 aircraft, including a Canberra and a transport plane. A journalist asked if the press could view some of these downed aircraft, but Nkomo refused for security reasons. The aircraft obviously did not exist. Zambian Premier Konda, too, started crying. Quote, "We have lost quite a few people, and the camp is almost completely destroyed. How do you talk to criminals who use napalm against us?" End quote. That was rather ironic from a man who was harboring terrorists that mostly targeted women and children. The Rhodesians, meanwhile, were ecstatic. The situation in general was, of course, still bleak. They had lost their country to some degree already with the transitional government, and would soon lose it completely. For now, however, they made the best of it. Revenge had been total, and Green Leader became a household name overnight. The famous recording was released, and soon enough, John Edmund released his Green Leader theme, in which segments of the recording were interspersed with song lyrics. It became an instant bestseller and shot up the Rhodesian charts. Joshua Nkomo certainly wasn't laughing anymore. He had been offered an open goal to become the leader of Zimbabwe, yet he had instead chosen to bring down a civilian airliner and massacre the survivors, including women and children. This directly led to his forces being absolutely decimated. He was now nothing more than a joke. The throne was now Mugabe's, and Nkomo would remain a political non-entity for the rest of his life. Mugabe, meanwhile, would go on to commit genocide against Nkomo's Matabele tribe. Around 20,000 of them would perish. Very few of them were actually former Zipra soldiers. When it was all said and done, it seems, Nkomo was the big loser from shooting down that plane, not the whites. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps a lot. And as always, an especially big thank you to those of you who have signed up to my subscribe star or as a YouTube member. It's truly what keeps this channel going. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. Thank you.